Hello and welcome. My name is Debbie Lynn Toomey. I am Tufts Medical Center's Injury Prevention Coordinator, and welcome to Aging Strong, which is Tufts Medical Center's injury prevention and outreach program that's dedicated to sharing information and resources that empowers the older adults. This program is sponsored by the City of Quincy's Health Department. Today's topic is really an interesting one. It has to do with grandparents raising their grandchildren under the age of 18. And today we have a special guest speaker, and she is Becca Thomas, who is the Director of Injury Prevention and Control, and she is from the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. Becca, welcome.
Thanks, Debbie. I'm so glad to be here and share this important information with your audience.
Great. Well, you know what? It's really very interesting, and it's so timely as well because the amount of grandparents who are raising their grandchildren has gone up. And bringing awareness to something that we automatically assume that they already know, especially if they're grandparents, right? How to take care of infants, especially when they're sleeping. So as we all know, research out there would come and say, this is the best way to do it. And then after a few years, another research would contradict, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's so true. And that's the point of science, right? We're just always seeking answers. And that means that it can change from time to time. So I really want to make sure that we're in a space together where grandparents and even older adults who might be supporting other families with young children and infants know what the most current practice that we promote for infant safe sleep is.
Yeah, exactly. The most current. So I just want to share with everybody, I was looking up some information, and according to the United States Census Bureau, and this is based on their 2018 American Community Survey, grandparents still work to support their grandchildren. They still work. This is not all grandparents, but many grandparents. And I guess, according to the survey, about 1.3 million grandparents in the labor force are responsible for most of the basic care of co-resident grandchildren under the age of 18. That's a lot of people, a lot of grandparents. So, Becca, I'm going to put on the slide presentation. Please let me know that you can see it, and then we'll begin your talk.
Thank you, Debbie. I really appreciate that introduction. And it's true, there's so many grandparents out there and older adults who are taking care of young children. It's mostly due to the opioid pandemic or epidemic, but there's a lot of other reasons too. And also, grandparents are just phenomenal resources, and older adults are phenomenal resources for families of all shapes and sizes. So one thing that we wanted to point out is you are a trusted messenger when it comes to supporting families. When it comes to parenting advice, immediate family members, including grandparents and siblings, are the most trusted source, valued even more than friends and teachers, the survey found. So what you share and what you say and what you bring into a family's lives has a lot of weight and a lot of value. So we wanted to have a little conversation today just to make sure that we're all on the same page about what best practices for infant sleep are, because it has changed pretty significantly in the past 30, 40 years. So we want to make sure that everybody's up to date and has that best information. And I wanted to start on the next slide just by asking some questions to you as an audience, just to get like a little bit of a sense of what you already know. So wanted to ask you what you think the safest position for a baby to sleep: on their belly, on their back, or on their side. And Debbie, do you know?
Yeah, you know what? I'm going to tell you how I did it about 30 years ago, almost 30 years ago. My answer is C, on their side.
Interesting.
Don't judge me.
No judgment. This is a judgment-free zone. This is just an open conversation. And a lot, my babies, I have a 6-year-old and a 2-year-old, and they like to sleep on their side. I'd put them on their back and they'd roll up on their side. And it was amazing to see a little 1-month-old who's able to get themselves on their side and just stay there. Mm-hmm. And I have another question for you, the next question, and I'll get to the right answers in just a moment too. So where is the safest place for baby to sleep? Is it alone in a crib, in their caregiver's room in a crib, or in a caregiver's bed? And this is really the whole conversation today is going to focus around those under 1 infants. So Debbie, when your baby 30 years ago was sleeping on its side, where were they?
Well, I will say I'll give you two answers, B and C, because I was breastfeeding my baby and I was so sleep deprived that sometimes I would have to have the baby in bed with me. But I got to say that I did have a barrier between my husband, the baby, and then of course the baby and myself. So that way my husband didn't like roll over onto us. And also the bassinet was in our room as well. So I could get to the baby easily.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is, we'll get into the answers now on the next slide. So the best practices for infant safe sleep is to actually put them on their back, flat on their back. And it's recommended that babies up to 12 months old sleep in their caregiver's room. This helps regulate body temperature and breathing and heart rate and all these wonderful interconnections between two different humans of different ages. But it's also recommended, highly recommended, that they sleep alone in an approved crib or pack and play or bassinet, etc. And that approved part is really important. We have the Consumer Product Safety Commission that keeps track of all sorts of different devices out there and tells us when babies are at risk for dying while they're sleeping in certain cribs. And another important factor here is also keeping any toys, pillows, or blankets out of that space too. So even Debbie, when you say that there was a barrier, we're going to get into some of those best practices and risk reduction and harm reduction about those barriers, because even that best intention for preventing the rollover on a baby can cause a suffocation hazard for a baby. Mm-hmm. So moving on to the next slide too. Mm-hmm. I just want to share some data and some information. You've probably heard of SIDS, or some people call it a cot death, or there's a lot of different terms for it. But this is when a baby dies suddenly and unexpectedly while they're sleeping before the first age of life. So we've seen in the 90s, we saw nationally some really great reductions in the number of infants who are dying this way. But here in Massachusetts, we still see about almost 2 classroom full of kindergartners who don't show up on their first day because they died as an infant. So the preliminary data from 2018 and 2019 says that there are about 28, 27 infants who died this way. And we've really plateaued, since 2011. It looks like it's bouncing around a little bit here, but this is a really stable number. We're not seeing a lot of reductions in this space right now. So it's another reason that we want to make sure that we're sharing the message and we're talking about harm reduction and we're talking about all of the preventable pieces of sudden unexpected infant death, which not all of them are completely preventable, but there's a lot that we can do with our physical environment to make sure that we're keeping our babies safe.
Becca, before we move on to the next slide, is there any data that shows this is more prevalent in certain cities or age group of parents? Is it for younger parents who have, unfortunately have this type of situation happen to them, or ethnicity?
Definitely, we see a big inequities in race and ethnicity, some along geographic lines as well. So urban dwellers, people who live in cities, people who are of lower socioeconomic status, so people who are experiencing poverty, and folks who are of color, especially Black parents and Hispanic or Latinx parents, are at increased risk for SIDS. But it's not. Oh, and also boy infants are more predisposed to experiencing SIDS as well. But these are not. They're not genetic characteristics. They're really about social determinants of health, and we're going to get into that in just a minute to explain some of the nuances behind this. Mm-hmm. But I wanted to make sure that I was clear on the definition here, because this can be called so many different things and show up in so many different spaces. So we call it here in Massachusetts, and from the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, it's called sudden and unexpected death of an infant, or SUID. And that generally happens under the age of 1. There are other things called sudden death in youth, which is over the age of 1. It's the leading cause of death among infants from 1 month to 12 months old. So that before 1 month, it tends to be gestational malformations and other pregnancy-related complications. But from that 1 month to 12-month old, that's really what infants are dying from. And nationally, 3,500 babies die from SUID every year in the United States. We're really lucky in Massachusetts. That number is the rate and the number is much lower here in Massachusetts than it is in other places. And to dive into the nuances of this a little bit more on the next slide, I wanted to give you a couple more definitions, because how we think about cot death or SIDS has really changed a lot over the past 40 or so years. So I wanted to describe a little bit about what we are now seeing or knowing in the data. So SUID is classified under 3 different causes. One is SIDS. That's probably the most common phrase that people have heard, sudden infant death syndrome. And we really don't know the total cause of SIDS. This is the majority of SUID cases overall, but we don't, the way that we determine that it's a SIDS is the medical examiner can find no other cause or explanation for why this infant died. And the risk factors related to this, there's a lot related to genetic predisposition. So a family who has experienced SIDS somewhere along their intergenerational infants who die from SIDS, their siblings are about 4 times more likely to also die from SIDS, which is just so tragic to think about. But it's really, we don't know the cause. We can't screen for it yet. We can't do any testing for it, but there are certain populations that are at higher risk. Another cause of SUID is called accidental strangulation and suffocation in bed. And this is very preventable. So this is when a baby gets wedged between a mattress and a headboard, or when someone overlays or rolls onto an infant or a pillow or a blanket, or anything falls into their face and can block their breathing. So this is when we talk about safe sleep, a lot of our focus is here on ASSB, the accidental strangulation and suffocation in bed, because we do find that there are a lot of these cases that do have soft bedding. So there's a lot of mitigation or harm or risk reduction that we can do in those spaces. The third one is called undetermined causes. And this is when the medical examiner can't decide if it was SIDS or something else. So there might be some kind of influencing factor, like the baby had a cold or the baby had soft bedding, but they're not convinced that it was strangulation or suffocation. So this undetermined cause is really like, we can't get to the root. There's a potential thing that caused this death, so it's not SIDS, but we can't decide whether or not that was the ultimate cause of the death. Does that make sense, Debbie?
Yeah. That's unfortunate. I was the ASSB just. It reminded me a couple weekends ago, I went to a baby shower. And of course, the baby showers, there's a lot of rattles, a lot of stuffed animals, things that you would normally typically see in the baby's crib along with the baby's blanket, a mobile, all these different things that could, I guess, based on your presentation, could potentially cause strangulation or suffocation.
Yes.
Yeah.
They're so cute to look at and so fun to have, but they don't belong in baby's bed. So those are things that I have a big bucket of stuffed animals that I keep next to my baby's crib instead of keeping them in the crib. And blankets too, we'll talk about some of that a little bit too, but bundling that baby up in some pajamas, and even a couple pairs of pajamas if it's really cold out, because we know in Massachusetts it gets real cold, and especially if you can't afford those oil prices out there, then your house could, or your dwelling could, get really cold. So it's really important to keep that baby bundled up and keep the blanket for awake time. Keep it for cuddles in the future. Don't put it in the crib with the baby.
Exactly.
And I wanted to talk a little bit about social determinants of health, because Debbie, we mentioned earlier that people of color, people of lower socioeconomic status, et cetera, are at higher risk for their baby experiencing SIDS. And this is not a moral failing. This is not a genetic predisposition. This is really because of social determinants of health. So if you don't have economic stability, there's a good chance that you don't have great access to healthcare. And healthcare, especially prenatally, is very important for preventing SIDS. Babies who have a low birth weight, who are born premature, or at a young gestational age, have a much greater risk of dying from SIDS than babies who are full term and have a healthy birth weight. So that access to prenatal care can really help a woman or a pregnant person get to the point where they can have a full gestational experience. And we know that women of color especially have much greater rates of preterm birth and low birth weight. And there's a lot around systemic racism and the history of racism that feeds into that system. So it's not, I just want to make sure that people know that this is not a moral failing. This is a systems-wide issue with making sure that we get pregnant people all of the access to healthcare, to safe sleep environments. We need to make sure that people have clean air quality, because that's one of the reasons that we see in city dwellings higher rates of SIDS, because the air quality isn't great. There's so many cars and traffic and pollutants out there that it can really affect the baby's respiratory system. And I could talk about social determinants of health all day long, but that's not what we're here for. So if you ever want to learn more about that, just Google social determinants of health or reach out. My contact information is at the end, and I can send you all sorts of resources to learn more about social determinants of health. All right.
Next slide.
Next slide. So I told you we're going to focus mostly on behaviors that support SID prevention today. And that is, there's no baby that's not at risk for SIDS. SIDS is we don't yet have all of the science and research to prevent it. But for those accidental strangulation and suffocation in bed, and even certain other behaviors can reduce the risk of SIDS. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit today about risk factors. These are things present that can increase the risk of a baby dying from SIDS, and protective factors, things that are present that will protect the baby from experiencing SIDS or SUID. And there's a lot we can do, but it requires some real support from caregivers and from their connections and their community. I was too. I don't think you can get through an infancy without being sleep deprived. But some of these practices, the risk comes into play when you are that sleep deprived. So caregivers and their community, including grandparents or older adults, that's where we really need to come in and support them in these safe practices and make sure that they have the space to do it the right way or the safe way. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about a couple of those risk factors. And I've grouped it into 3 different things. One is the parent and caregiver behaviors, which is mostly what we're going to focus on today. One is infant biology, and the other one is environment, which parents and caregivers can have a lot of control over their environment as well. So some of the parent and caregiver behaviors are placing an infant on their side or stomach to sleep. That is a risk factor. And smoking during and after pregnancy is an incredible risk factor. The Massachusetts Department of Public Health has some wonderful tobacco cessation resources, especially geared towards pregnant people. So that's, if you can support your loved ones who are pregnant or who have recently had an infant, in not smoking, or if you yourself are a smoker, some of the tips there are making sure that you change your clothes before you see the baby, because even that tertiary smoke, the smoke that like sticks on your clothes and on your hands, that can affect the baby and their brain development. So making sure that that baby is protected from all smoking is really, really important. Infant biology, infants younger than 4 months are at the greatest risk for experiencing SUID. It's not to say that over 4 months, the risk disappears completely, but we see the most cases happening from that 1 to 4 months of age. Babies who are born before 37 weeks of gestation or had a birth weight under 5.8 ounces are at a special risk, and that's why it's so important to get that prenatal care. And then also we saw in the data that if infant biology, if they have a cold or they're congested, we see more cases related to, those are generally put into the undetermined causes bucket. But I bring it up in this space because it's when babies are stuffy and grumpy and upset because they don't feel good, that can be a time when caregivers really want to pull them into the bed and comfort them, but that's an especially high risk moment. So it's really important to practice safe sleep when baby's congested, even though it feels very contradictory to what we want to do. And then the environment. So this is where the baby's sleeping. So broken cribs or cribs with missing parts are really risky for infants. And I know it's, I got a hand-me-down crib, but it's really important to check for all of the parts and make sure that you can assemble it up to the standards that it was intended to be built, because otherwise it can really put the baby at risk. Sleeping devices that don't meet CPSC standards, so those old bassinets or cribs that don't have the slats are too wide apart, and you can go to the CPSC website and learn all sorts of things about the best safe sleep environments for babies. But couches, beds, those things are really dangerous. Those don't meet the CPSC standards. And then overheating. I think a lot of people want to bundle up their baby and keep them nice and toasty warm, but that can actually be a risk. We want babies to be able to be comfortable and not too hot. So if you see a baby sweating or red, that's a bad sign for a sleeping baby. So making sure that a room is cool enough, and that can be really hard. If in Massachusetts, we get some pretty hot days, and if you don't have an air conditioner, it can be dangerous. So, stripping baby down, some people don't think it looks comfortable for a baby to sleep naked, but it's totally okay. It's much safer for them to sleep naked if it's hot. Bed sharing, and I'll get into some definitions of bed sharing, but that's when an adult and a baby sleep in the same bed. That can be really dangerous, especially if it's not a breastfeeding parent, if there are pillows in the bed, if there's blankets, if it's nice and comfy. That's not a good place for baby. And then soft objects in their safety approved crib or bassinet, like blankets or stuffies, or pretty much anything in a crib can be considered a suffocation hazard. Think about how little and teeny tiny those cute little babies are. It's so easy to block their airways because they're just so little. So those soft objects are a risk factor as well.
Becca, I can hear some grandparents saying, wait a second, I'm confused. So I can't put a blanket on the baby, and we don't want the baby to freeze, and we don't want them to overheat. What am I supposed to do as far as clothing the baby so they can sleep properly and comfortably?
Yeah, it totally depends on the temperature of your house and the temperature outside and how things are going. So generally what we say, it's best to keep the room temperature between 68 and 72 degrees. And if it's between 68 and 72 degrees, then just a regular onesie or, a long sleeve shirt, zip up onesie or, button up onesie is the best thing for the baby. But if it gets over that temperature, then stripping that baby down is great. And if it's below that temperature, adding extra layers of pajamas, so a second onesie or a second PJ set, that's the best way to go. The blankets, they even if you put them in a swaddle, babies like to break out of their swaddles sometimes, and swaddles can cause hip dysplasia too. So we don't recommend that babies get swaddled in a blanket even when they go to sleep. We really recommend putting extra PJs on them if it's below 68 degrees to keep them warm, but no blankets, please.
Mhm,
Is
mhm.
that helpful,
Yes,
Debbie?
yes, definitely, definitely. I used to love putting my babies in, it's almost like a onesie with no legs,
Mm-hmm.
like a bunting bag. So, you can just see, their head and then the arms, but you don't see their legs. So you could it's almost like a sleeping bag, 90 in a way.
Yeah, yeah, we had sleep sacks like that. Yeah, the sleep sacks are great. They're, and even there's things called woombies where they can get all like cuddled up. Once a baby can kind of roll over, though, it's important that they have their arms free so
Mhm.
that they can't, even though they're pretty helpless at that age, as soon as they can start rolling and using their arms, it's really important that they have access to their
Yeah.
arms.
Yeah. And you know what? Babies grow out of their clothes so fast. And I have no shame in sharing that I used to go to secondhand stores to buy some of their clothes because they just grow out of them so fast. And of course, I would, whatever clothes I had, I would give it to my sisters or whoever else needed it. But they grow out of the clothes so fast and they're so expensive. So, don't be afraid to go to different secondhand stores, to consignment stores, Goodwill stores to find clothing that you think is going to be comfortable for the baby.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Thanks. All right. So back is best. And you're going to hear me say this so many times today, but it's just because I really want to drive this home. Because it previously, a couple generations ago, people said belly was best. And, infants were really encouraged to sleep on their belly. But that's really changed. We say back is best because it helps a baby's, I'll get into this on the next slide, but it helps them clear their airways, and it really has a dramatic effect on reducing SIDS.
Mhm.
So putting them on their side can cause them to their airways to be blocked. But once a baby can do it themselves, like I said, my 1 week, she was even like 3 days old, she would get up on her side. That's okay. Like if they're doing it themselves, that's okay. But what we want to do is put them in the safest position possible, and then we can be hands off because we want them to sleep. One of the interesting things about this, why we stopped putting babies to sleep on their belly, is because babies can sleep really, really deeply. I don't know if anybody's seen like those babies that just are so asleep. And that's actually kind of dangerous. We want babies to be able to wake up and rouse themselves. We don't want them to get into such a deep sleep that their automated processing for breathing is compromised. That really, really, really deep sleep for a baby can actually mean that they can't wake themselves up, and they could stop breathing. So it seems a little bit like torture, like we're trying to sleep deprive our babies, but it is for their safety, and it's sleep deprivation for a baby isn't quite as bad as oxygen deprivation, and putting them to sleep on their belly can really cause oxygen deprivation. And so to drive this point home a little bit more, I have a couple graphics for you all that I hope will clarify why we put babies to sleep on their back instead of their belly. Because I think a lot of people, when they think about back versus belly, they think about spit up and what happens when a baby spits up, and won't the baby choke on the spit up if they're laying on their back. And that's actually not quite true because of the biology of our trachea, or our breathing tube, and our esophagus, which is our swallowing tube. So when you put a baby on their back, the spit up can come up and then go back down their esophagus, their swallowing tube. But if you put them on their stomach, the way that it happens in here, when they spit up, it will actually go back down their trachea, or their breathing tube. So if you see on the first image, the trachea is on top of the breathing tube is on top, and the swallowing tube is on the bottom. So spit up goes up, down. I think a lot of people think about adults, if they vomit while they're on their back, it can cover their nose and cover everything, and people can choke with vomit that way. But spit up is very different from adult vomiting, and the force with which it comes out, the quantity with which it comes out. It's really best to have baby on their back so it can just go up and back down, and they won't choke on it. And the next slide just shows the reverse as well, just so pointing out how that spit up can go down their breathing tube if they're on their belly.
Very interesting. Very interesting. I like how you distinguished the difference between the spit up and vomiting, because we know when you have an infant, every spit up is a vomit, because sometimes they vomit a lot or spit up a lot. And, you have to change your clothes and their clothes, everybody's clothes, because everything would just come up. So thank you so much for distinguishing the difference between spit up and vomiting.
Yeah, my pleasure. All right, let's talk a little bit about some definitions and practices for sleeping. So room sharing versus bed sharing and cribs. And there's a lot of nuance and detail in here. So I'm going to try to hit some of the high levels in case you hear some of these terms out in the community. So bed sharing is specifically when an adult and an infant sleep in an adult bed together. And this is a big increase for SUID, for accidental strangulation and suffocation in bed, as well as SIDS. Room sharing is when there's a crib or a bassinet or any kind of safe sleep device in the same room as the caregiver. This decreases the risk of SIDS. This is a really good thing, with some caveats, because when that baby is really close to your bed, there's a lot of caregivers out there that just want to, it's so exhausting. They get so tired. And so since the baby's so close, they actually put the baby in the bed with them because it's right there. So if that's happening, you can ask the people that you're working with or you're supporting, your loved ones, like you could ask them, oh, are you pulling the baby into your bed with you? And that might be a good time to move the baby back into a different room if there's space for it. Because I know I did that eventually, and we all slept a lot better after that because you're not quite waking up as much. So room sharing is phenomenal unless it's creating a risk for bed sharing. And then it's not so great, and you should revise your strategy. Co-sleeping is a much more general term that it just means that they're sleeping in close proximity. And we want that. We want co-sleeping. We don't necessarily want bed sharing, but we do want co-sleeping because it does help with that heat and body regulation, the breathing regulation, the heart rate regulation. It's really nice to have those two humans together.
Definitely.
So room sharing is that what we really want to see happen, especially for those first 12 months, unless it's causing a problem. It's where the baby's in the same area for this first 6 to 12 months. It decreases the risk of SIDS by 50%. It's much more safe than bed sharing. It makes it easier for a parent or caregiver to feed, comfort, and watch their baby. But again, that room should be between 68 and 72 degrees, which is kind of tricky to keep it between those temperatures, especially if you don't have the resources to pay for air conditioning, electricity, oil, etc. So that we understand that can be really hard, and there's things that you can do to work on that. And bed sharing. So we've talked about this a little bit. This is where I think grandparents can come in and provide a lot of information and support, in a kind and compassionate way. We don't want to shame, stigmatize, or new parents. They've got it all going on. It's real tricky. It's real tough. So everything here should just be done with as much love and patience as you can possibly muster. But we don't like to see bed sharing. It can really increase a risk for SUID. But there's times when people are going to do it because they're exhausted and they're breastfeeding, or because they don't have any other place to put the baby, or it's part of their culture and their history and their heritage that they've always done this. So there's a couple of things that we want to make sure that that you can communicate with your young families about how to bed share as safely as possible. So the next slide, even in bed sharing situations, back is best. So if they're in the same bed together, make sure that the baby is on its back. You can actually check around to make sure that there's no entrapment hazards on the bed. Some people actually recommend moving the mattress onto the floor away from any walls, so that if the baby rolls off the bed, they can't get trapped between the headboard or between a wall. And that's called wedging, and it causes suffocation. And if it stays in the bed frame, making sure that it's like really snug in that bed frame, there's no chance that the baby can slip in. And You want to keep the adult bed free of blankets, pillows, bumper pads, window cord, anything. Like keep everything out of the adult bed. So I'm going to admit that I also bed shared with my second baby because I knew how hard it was with the first one. And I really struggled with my first one to get any kind of sleep. So what we did with the second one, I kicked my husband out of the bed. He wasn't allowed in the bed for the first 4 months or so, because non-breastfeeding parents are especially risky in a bed sharing environment. Breastfeeding parents don't generally get very much sleep anyways. They're more easily roused. They're really in tune with the baby. So bed sharing with a breastfeeding parent is still very risky, but it's less risky than having anybody else in that bed. What I also did was I didn't sleep with pillows. I didn't sleep with blankets. I didn't have anything except for me and my baby in that bed. And we just, dealt with being cold for about 4 months. But if you're going to do that bed sharing, another thing is American beds tend to be really soft and squishy. So think about that with the mattress type that you have too. You really want a firm mattress for that baby. The more soft it is, the more that their chin can get tucked down and blocked, or the more that they can just get something, soft in their way and get their airways blocked. So having that firm mattress, putting it on the floor, no one else in the bed, no pillows, no blankets. That's the way to reduce the risk as much as possible, but there will always be risk in a bed sharing environment.
Definitely.
And here's a couple of those safe sleep surfaces. This is what we most want to see babies in. We don't like to see things that prop them up like a car seat or anything like that, because it can again block their airways. But these are our safety approved cribs and bassinets. And on the next slide, these are things that we're worried about with a baby. These are not intended for sleep. And one of the things that happened, the American Academy of Pediatrics a number of years ago put out some very strong statements about not bed sharing. And what happened was so many breastfeeding parents tried to stay awake with their baby, and they would sit in chairs or sit on futons and try to breastfeed that baby. And they were falling asleep while they did that. And that was causing wedging in couches. It was causing traumatic brain injuries when babies fell off of the chair or onto the floor. So what we say is if you can't stay awake, the best thing to do is to go to an adult bed with nothing else in it. It's better to be in an adult bed than to fall asleep on one of these unsafe sleep surfaces because they're really dangerous. That includes car seats and strollers and those fun little seats like you see on the screen in front of you.
Mm-hmm. Again, Becca, I could hear some grandparents saying, "What? I put the baby in the car seat so we can go to the store and the baby falls asleep. Or I go for a stroll with the baby and I put them in the stroller and they fall asleep because that's the only way they can fall asleep." So, how can we be okay about what we're doing using the proper devices like the car seat and strollers and still be able to allow the baby to sleep properly without feeling like we're going against recommendations?
Yeah, it's important to keep supervising the baby if they do fall asleep on one of those devices. So if you can move the baby when they fall asleep, which is not always possible, you might be driving somewhere, you might be out at the store. But aside from that, they can stay in that device, but just make sure that their chin is up. If you start to notice that their head is falling down, this can block their airways. So you want to make sure that their chin is up as much as possible, and then move them when you can, and just keep that constant supervision. While you're shopping, while you're doing whatever, just like check in. You can put your hand on the baby. Again, that is that really deep sleep that we get worried about. So if you're out in a noisy place, and they're probably going to be a little bit aroused, they're not going to be in a hyper deep sleep. So just keeping their airways open and making sure that they're okay as you go along. I used to, I had the luxury of being in a two-person caregiver role. So one of us in the beginning would sit in the back with the baby in the back seat of the car if we were driving around, to make sure that we were keeping an eye on baby who had fallen asleep in a car seat and their needs. But those mirrors are really helpful too, and just keeping an eye on baby. They're asleep in the car seat if the car is moving, and just making sure that chin is up. I hope that helps.
Yeah, very good.
It's hard and complicated.
I used to the babies would sleep so deeply that sometimes I would put my finger underneath their nostrils just so I could know that they're breathing, so you get, as a mother, you get so paranoid. It's like, are they okay? And you don't want to wake them up, but still you want to make sure they're breathing. So sometimes I'd put one of my fingers under their nostrils just to kind of feel the airflow. And then
absolutely. I had a little hand mirror. I would put the hand mirror and watch it fog up under their nose.
The things we do.
Absolutely. And we've talked about this, but I told you I was going to tell you it a million times. Nothing inside the crib, and even things around the crib can be dangerous. So if you think about if you have a bassinet next to your adult bed, think about the height of that bassinet in your bed. Can a pillow fall into it? Can a blanket fall into it? Because when you sleep as a caregiver, you're going to sleep because you have to. You're going to go into that deep sleep really quickly. So you might not notice if something falls into the crib or the bassinet. So you want to make sure that there's some space between the adult bed and that lower bassinet, that nothing can fall in it. If they're in a crib, you want to make sure that there's no window cords or anything else nearby the crib, because we've seen some really tragic cases of babies being strangled. And there are some new regulations out there, but we know Massachusetts has a lot of older housing stock. So we still see those window cords that are really dangerous. So keep baby away from those window cords. And don't put any blankets over the side of the crib. That can fall into the crib and baby can strangle on that or suffocate on that. And we've seen that happen before. We don't make these rules because we think it's fun to tell caregivers what to do. We do it because we have seen so many deaths of babies that could have been prevented. Mm-hmm. So just keep everything out. And you might be told, or caregivers can be told, to put like a wedging or a positioning device if the baby's congested. That can actually cause the baby to roll down the crib and get trapped in their own crib. So we don't want to see that one either. And bumper pads are actually, the sale of bumper pads is no longer legal. Bumper pads do nothing to protect a baby. They put babies at much greater risk. Cribs are not nearly as dangerous as they used to be. People like to put bumper pads on so the babies wouldn't stick their arms through or they get caught in the cribs. I have to tell you, I've never seen a baby break an arm or a leg or get hurt in any way by getting their arms in the slats. They might just get a little uncomfortable and fussy for a minute. You just, pull them out. They're fine. They're not going to break anything. But the bumper pads, they can push their face up against them and suffocate. So we really don't want to see any kind of bumpers in the cribs. And one of the other things that we did, I think people really liked bumpers because we used to have those drop side cribs where you could push the side rail down. Those are no longer sold. And if you see those, do not put an infant in those, because we saw a lot of infants lose their little fingers and toes and even feet and stuff in those, because they would put their leg through and then the side would drop and it would cause a really bad injury to the baby. So that's why bumpers became popular, but those cribs don't exist anymore. So we don't need bumpers anymore.
Oh my goodness. Oh, wow. I didn't even think of that. That's the kind of crib I had.
Yeah. I'm glad they're not on the market anymore, honestly. That's why Consumer Product Safety Commission is so important for things like that.
Thank goodness. All right.
Yeah. Okay. We're running a little bit low on time. So I think I might just I think these are all things that folks know, but I think it's really helpful just to reiterate as well. So we talked about smoking earlier. Smoking is very, very, very dangerous for a baby. And Massachusetts has some great smoking cessation. And it's actually not on this slide. So I will follow up some other time with the smoking cessation information, because there's a hotline that's specifically geared towards pregnant and parenting people. But that smoke exposure just puts that baby at so much risk. It's really dangerous.
Mhm.
And breastfeeding is so great if you can do it. And we don't want to put any undue pressure. Like I said before, it's so hard being a new parent. So we don't want to put any undue pressure on them to breastfeed, but it really does do a wonderful job of reducing the risk of sudden infant death syndrome or SIDS. And mom can often fall asleep while she's breastfeeding. So just I have some tips later on in this presentation about what happens if you fall asleep or if falls asleep while they're breastfeeding. So it's just important to support people and let them know, like, if you fall asleep while you're breastfeeding, it's best to go to an adult bed with nothing in it. Don't stay on that chair or in that rocker or wherever you are. That's a risky spot. So if you really can't stay awake while baby's eating, go over to an adult bed.
Definitely. I believe, well, I don't know what the data is, but with the formula shortage that's going on right now, I'm sure a lot more new mothers are wanting to at least try to breastfeed just to kind of really protect and feed their child, right?
Yeah. But it is not easy. Let me tell you that much. So it's, yeah, it's great. And for the grandparents out there, or for the older adults supporting a family, that having that extra set of hands if you're breastfeeding, or having that someone who can hold the baby for you for like a couple hours while you catch some sleep, those are ways to help new parents practice breastfeeding, because it really does take a village and it's so hard. So if you can be there to just support, hold the baby, get them water and snacks, because man, do you need food and water if you're breastfeeding. So just creating that environment where they can successfully breastfeed is really helpful.
Very.
And tummy time, look at this baby. One of my favorite things about going through Safe Sleep presentations is all the pictures of babies, because I love babies so much. So I hope they're bringing some smiles to your face. But tummy time is a practice when babies are awake. It helps them develop their necks, their arm, their shoulders. It helps prevent the flat spots on the back of the baby's heads that can develop when they're sleeping on their back all the time. But we want to make sure that, and it also prevents torticollis, which is where certain muscles develop at a different rate and can kind of make the baby look a little bit sideways and strange and needs an intervention. So tummy time is really important for that physical development. But always make sure that baby and adult are awake during tummy time. If baby starts to fall asleep during tummy time, it's not the right time for tummy time. It's time to just get them doing something else, or move them over to their crib, put them on their back and get them into sleep. And babies, they're probably not going to like tummy time at first. So you can just, make it fun and engaging. Get down on the ground, give them a little toy, give them something to work for, their favorite stuffy, their favorite whatever colored object in front of them, and make it a little bit more enjoyable. And they'll get used to it over time. And you only have to start with like a minute here, 30 seconds there, and build up more and more over time. It's just really important that they have that time on their belly while they're awake. And pacifiers are actually really great for SUID prevention. I feel like this is good news for people, because it's like, I need tools. So pacifiers help babies clear their airways, and it helps them stay a little bit aroused while they're sleeping. So it's actually really great, especially if breastfeeding is already well established, but it's such a good preventive measure that even when we even recommend it while breastfeeding is still being established, as long as there's nothing attached to the pacifier. We see a lot of things now with like little stuffed animals attached to the pacifier, or like a string that you can clip onto their onesie. But at nap time, at bedtime, it's best, that's not the right type of pacifier to use. Just a regular plain old pacifier is the best to use. It actually even decreases ear infections. Pacifiers are a wonderful tool for baby.
Wow.
All right, and skin to skin is this newer, I feel like it's a little bit newer. It's being promoted in a lot of birthing hospitals. And it's when an adult and a baby get to be naked together. And it really helps regulate their breathing and their body temperature. It helps create that bond. And it's just a wonderful way right out the gate to help that baby start developing healthily. But if you're sleepy, that's not the best time to practice skin to skin. And grandparents can do this too. Older adults can take their shirt off and get that baby right in there with those cuddles too. It doesn't have to be mom or dad or, anybody. It can be really any human with that skin to skin contact is really great.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said about that, because it's not just the warmth, but the scent of that caring adult, the sound of their voice, the feeling of the heartbeat. There's just so many different layers that that can benefit the infant and also the caregiver.
Yeah, it's true. It helps healing postpartum, post-birth as well. Lovely. All right. Debbie, tell me, which one of these babies is sleeping safely?
C.
Yeah.
Ding, ding,
all right.
Ding.
You are correct.
Yay.
It's on its back. It's in a pack and play. There's nothing else in it. It's not in a swaddle. This baby looks nice and comfy, cozy. The other ones, there's a suffocation hazard in every single one of those pictures. Okay, so to recap, the ABCs of safe sleep, and this is hopefully a helpful little way to remember this information. A stands for alone. Baby shouldn't sleep with other people, animals, pillows, blankets, or other soft objects. That includes siblings, anything. On their back, so B is back. Baby should be placed on their back to sleep for every sleep. That includes naps. That in every single sleep. I think I've seen people who say, oh, well, just, for their nap, I'll put them on their belly, or I put them on their side on the couch. And it's really every single sleep. And babies who are used to sleeping on their back, that one time on their belly or their side can be especially risky, because their body is attuned to being on their back. So just even one time of not on their back can be really dangerous. And then C stands for crib. Baby should not sleep in an adult bed, couch, armchair, car seat, bouncer, or on a parent, except for in extreme situations. So crib is the last one, alone back crib. That's the best way to sleep a baby. I'm not sure we have so much time for this one.
I don't think we do. Do you want to just go over to the resource?
Yeah, well, go to the next slide. And maybe, hopefully you can all pause this if you're watching this online and just check this out a little bit. These are just some tips for if something unsafe happens, just about, moving to a safer space and waking up and just checking in on your surroundings and your needs to make sure that if something unsafe does happen, it's not the end of the world. There's still something that you can do. So really making that plan and taking those action steps to keep baby safe. And then on the next slide, there are a lot of resources on here. So I hope you can Google these things. Mass.gov has a great search engine on it. So if you go to mass.gov and put in safe sleep information for parents and caregivers, or any of these other topics, you'll see lots and lots of information about safe sleep. And this does have the tobacco. And then also acknowledging that we are talking about deaths of an infant, and people do experience sudden infant and child loss. It's a horrible tragedy and really traumatic. And Massachusetts has some great resources out there for people who are walking through that grief and that loss. So the Massachusetts Center for Unexpected Infant and Child Death has wonderful support groups and resources, websites, and helps find therapists, etc. So if you or someone you love is experiencing an unexpected infant or child death, reach out to that center. They are wonderful, wonderful people and supports. And I think that's it. Here's my contact information. And if you want to reach out to me at safe.sleep@mass.gov, I will answer any questions that you throw at us, or at least do my best to answer any questions, provide you with more resources and information. We love to hear from you and provide any technical assistance that we can. Thanks, Debbie.
Oh my goodness, Becca, that was really awesome. What came to mind, and it doesn't really have to do with the infant safety, but just to remind people or to bring in the forefront. Remember, we had a big meeting and a few years ago, and they talked about toddlers, how important it is to prevent toddlers from climbing up bookshelves or
yes.
Bedside or bedroom drawers, how those doors can fall onto the toddler. So can you just share a little bit about that? And then I'd love for you to spend maybe a couple of minutes on sharing with us other awareness that we should know about.
What Debbie was referencing there, we call it tip overs, furniture tip over. And, it's really important for toddlers to be able to climb. It's a really important developmental milestone for them, for both their physical development and their brain development. So we don't really want to prevent kids from climbing, but we do want to make it as safe as possible. So there's a lot of desks, dressers, bookshelves, etc. out there that if they fall on a climbing toddler, they will seriously injure or kill that toddler. So the best practice there is to attach them to the wall. And there's some really great furniture anchors out there that are actually they're up to code for earthquake prevention or earthquake damage prevention. So you want to get those types of hooks and really get those in the wall for any kind of. You might look at something and say that's not a tip hazard. Try it with the drawer open, or just try putting all your weight on the front of it. If it wobbles even a little bit, that's a risky thing. So get those all anchored up. And the same goes for TVs. We see a lot of TV tip over. The Consumer Product Safety Commission, again, has some wonderful resources for prevention on this topic as well. But those TVs that are up on stands, those can be really deadly. And, people use TV as a babysitter. Toddlers can kind of go up and try to touch them. So having TVs anchored to the wall is really important too. And speaking of falls and tip overs and that sort of thing, and another summer issue that we see quite a bit, especially on the South Shore, unfortunately, are window falls. So some important things to know about window falls this summer as you try to keep your space cool. Move all of the furniture away from windows. Because if toddler or kid can climb up on those furniture and look out that window, that's risky. If you can, open the window from the top down instead of the bottom up. That will prevent baby from being able to get up and out that window. And please remember that window screens are made for mosquitoes. They're not made for babies or humans. They will fall out and the baby will go with them. So it's really important to either put a window guard on, keep the furniture away, and make sure that the baby can't get through that window. Open it from the bottom down, or keep it closed if you can. And then it's also drowning season. When we see days that are above 86 degrees, we're much more likely to see a drowning fatality. So I hope you and your loved ones are out there taking swimming lessons, getting prepared for the water. Don't swim where it says not to swim. Always have your cell phone handy and ready for a 911 call. They can help you with CPR. And also, this is a sad message that I'm going to give you, but just remember, if you're not trained in water safety, you can't go and rescue someone who's out in the water. It's really tragic. You're going to have that impulse to go after and get them. But we've unfortunately seen far too many people die trying to rescue someone else in the water. I'd rather be reporting on one fatality than two. So just remember, don't go out into that water unless you're trained. And there are water rescue trainings available if you would like to get trained up on that.
Thank you so much for being here today to talk about safe sleep for older adults and sharing with us, some summer safety tips. Oh, one last tip for the summer is you try to avoid dehydration. Drink a lot of water. And that goes for you and also for the younger children that you are around. So I want to thank you, Becca Thomas, for being here today. I learned so much, and I hope everybody out there learned so much. And if you have any questions, you have her contact information. And I want to thank the Quincy Health Department for sponsoring this program. Thank you again, Becca. Thank you. Bye, everybody.